Some men lose a war and still believe they are above everyone in the room. Snow pressed softly against the narrow windows of Camp Ridley as the military truck rolled through the front gate just before dawn. The guards outside barely spoke. Their boots crushed frozen gravel beneath the pale yellow floodlights while the winter wind pushed long ribbons of smoke across the barracks. Inside the transport vehicle, General Otto Reinhardt sat perfectly still. His gray wool coat remained spotless despite 3 days on the road. His gloves rested neatly on his lap. Even now, after Germany had surrendered months earlier, he carried himself like a man who believed defeat was only temporary. The truck stopped with a hard jolt. One American soldier opened the rear door. Cold air rushed inside immediately. Reinhardt stepped down slowly, his polished boots touching American soil without hesitation. He looked around the camp once. Barbed wire, guard towers, steam rising from tin coffee cups. Young soldiers trying not to stare too long at the famous German officer now standing among them as a prisoner. Reinhardt's expression never changed. One guard motioned toward a narrow administrative building near the center of the compound. "This way, General." Reinhardt walked without speaking. The hallway inside smelled faintly of wet wool, old paper, and burnt coffee. Somewhere in the distance, a typewriter clacked steadily against the silence. The escort stopped outside a small interrogation room lit by a single hanging lamp. One soldier opened the door. "Your officer is waiting." Reinhardt entered calmly. Then he stopped. Behind the desk sat a black American captain in his early 30s wearing a neatly pressed uniform with silver bars on his shoulders. Captain Daniel Brooks looked up once from the file in front of him. Nothing more. No performance. No attempt at intimidation. Just quiet eyes and a still posture. Steam rose from a cup of coffee beside his hand. Reinhardt glanced at the nameplate on the desk. "Captain Daniel Brooks." For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then Reinhardt removed one glove finger by finger and let out a soft breath through his nose. "I requested to speak with a real officer." The room went silent. One of the young guards near the door stiffened immediately. Another looked toward Captain Brooks, waiting for the explosion everyone expected. But Daniel Brooks did not move. He simply closed the folder in front of him with careful precision. The sound echoed softly beneath the hanging light. Reinhardt watched him closely now, almost disappointed by the lack of reaction. The captain stood slowly from his chair, walked to the door, and locked it with a quiet click. Then he returned to the desk and sat down again. Calm, unhurried. The general narrowed his eyes slightly. Daniel folded his hands together and spoke in flawless German. "Would you prefer coffee before we begin, General Reinhardt?" For the first time since arriving at Camp Ridley, the German officer's expression changed. Captain Daniel Brooks slid the coffee cup across the desk without breaking eye contact. Steam curled slowly beneath the hanging lamp. General Otto Reinhardt looked down at the cup for a moment, but did not touch it. Outside the narrow window, snow drifted sideways through the camp lights while distant truck engines groaned somewhere beyond the wire fences. The room felt smaller now, quieter. Reinhardt leaned back in his chair carefully, studying the American captain with growing suspicion. "Your accent," he said in German. "Where did you learn it?" Daniel opened the folder again without urgency. "Munich first," he replied calmly. "Then Heidelberg." Reinhardt blinked once. It was small, almost invisible, but it was the first crack in the old man's certainty. Daniel turned a page. Paper whispered softly against paper. "You commanded the 71st Infantry Division during the winter retreat near Aachen." Reinhardt said nothing. Daniel continued. "You requested additional fuel transport on December 3, 1944. The request was denied." Reinhardt's eyes narrowed immediately. That information was classified. Daniel finally lifted his eyes from the file. "Not anymore." Silence settled heavily between them again. One of the guards near the door shifted his weight uncomfortably, but Daniel raised one hand slightly without looking. "Back." The guard became still again. Reinhardt slowly removed his gloves and placed them on the desk with precise movements. He no longer looked amused. "You are well prepared," he admitted quietly. Daniel did not answer the compliment. Instead, he reached for the coffee cup beside him and took a slow sip. The general watched every movement carefully now, as though trying to solve a puzzle that no longer made sense. Most interrogations Reinhardt had experienced followed predictable patterns. Pressure, anger, threats. Men trying too hard to appear powerful. But Captain Brooks spoke softly, moved slowly. Nothing about him appeared defensive. That disturbed Reinhardt more than open hostility ever could. Daniel turned another page in the file. You lost 8 officers during the retreat through Belgium, he said evenly. 3 from exposure. 2 disappeared during evacuation. 1 transferred to Berlin before the surrender. Reinhardt stared at him. Why are you telling me things I already know? Daniel closed the folder halfway. Because I want to know which losses still bother you. Reinhardt almost smiled at that. Almost. You believe this is psychology? No, Daniel replied calmly. I believe silence usually tells the truth faster than questions. The old German general looked toward the frosted window for several seconds. Snow reflected pale light across the side of his face, softening the deep lines near his eyes. For the first time, he appeared tired instead of arrogant. But the moment passed quickly. You are wasting your time, Reinhardt muttered. Daniel nodded once as though he had expected that answer already. Then he reached inside the folder and removed a black and white photograph. He placed it carefully on the table between them. Reinhardt looked down. The image showed a damaged railway station somewhere in occupied France. Several officers stood near the platform. One of them was Reinhardt himself. Much younger, confident, sharp uniform. Daniel rested both hands on the desk. This was taken in March of 1943. Reinhardt looked up slowly. Where did you get this? From your own archives. The general stared at the photograph again, but his attention shifted suddenly toward the handwriting in the corner. His own signature. Official military markings beneath it. He looked back at Daniel with a colder expression now. More careful. You have been studying me for a long time. Daniel said nothing for a moment. The radiator hissed softly against the wall. Somewhere outside, a guard laughed briefly before the sound disappeared into the winter wind. Finally, Daniel spoke. No, General. His voice remained level. I have been trying to understand what kind of man still needs to feel superior after losing everything. Reinhardt held his stare this time. Neither man moved. The coffee between them continued to steam quietly into the cold morning air. General Otto Reinhardt did not answer immediately. The old officer sat beneath the hanging light with one hand resting beside the untouched coffee cup, while snow continued brushing softly against the frosted window behind him. Captain Daniel Brooks remained perfectly still across the desk. No raised voice. No pressure. Just patience. Reinhardt finally leaned back slightly in his chair and studied the younger man with colder eyes than before. You speak as if you understand war, he said quietly in German. Daniel folded the edge of a document back into the folder. I understand men during war, he replied. That is usually worse. A faint sound escaped Reinhardt's nose. Not laughter exactly. Something closer to disbelief. You think very highly of yourself for an American captain. Daniel ignored the remark completely. He reached toward the photograph still lying between them and turned it a few inches beneath the lamp. Who took this picture? Reinhardt glanced down briefly. I do not remember. But you remember the station. The general remained silent. Daniel continued calmly. St. Quentin, northern France. March 17, 1943. Snow on the tracks. Delayed transport lines. Fuel shortage. Reinhardt looked at him again, more carefully this time. You have read reports. Daniel shook his head once. No. He tapped the corner of the photograph lightly. I was there. The room became very quiet after that. Even the guards near the door stopped shifting their boots. Reinhardt's expression changed slowly, like a man recalculating distance in the dark. Impossible, he muttered. Daniel reached for his coffee again. Not really. Reinhardt stared harder now. You were military intelligence? Translator unit at first. At first, Reinhardt repeated carefully. Daniel did not elaborate. That silence bothered the German officer more than any explanation would have. Outside, a truck engine started somewhere beyond the barracks. Its low rumble vibrated faintly through the walls before fading into the winter wind again. Reinhardt finally looked away from Daniel and toward the photograph once more. That station was chaos, he said quietly. Refugees everywhere. Soldiers freezing on the platforms. Daniel nodded once. I remember the children. Reinhardt's eyes lifted immediately. For the first time since entering the room, the old general looked uncertain instead of guarded. Daniel spoke without accusation, without anger. There was a little girl sitting beside the east wall wearing a blue scarf. Reinhardt blinked slowly. You remember that? She kept trying to warm her hands against a broken radiator. Daniel's voice remained calm, almost distant now. Nobody could get the heat working. Reinhardt stared at him across the desk, as if trying to understand how this conversation had slipped so far away from military ranks and interrogation tactics. The captain across from him was not trying to dominate the room. He was doing something worse. He was making the general remember things he had spent years burying beneath paperwork and command titles. Daniel opened another section of the file. Several papers inside carried German military stamps, faded by time. 3 civilian trains were delayed there that week, he said. One never arrived. Reinhardt's jaw tightened slightly. Daniel noticed immediately. He always noticed. You still remember that one, Daniel said softly. The general's voice dropped lower now. War creates missing trains. Daniel nodded once. Yes. Then he added quietly. And missing people. Reinhardt looked down at his gloves resting on the table. The leather had begun to crack near the fingertips from age and cold weather. He suddenly appeared older beneath the yellow light. Smaller somehow. Daniel let the silence remain untouched for several seconds before speaking again. You expected me to defend myself when you insulted me. Reinhardt did not answer. But men who need respect immediately usually lost it long before they entered the room. The old general slowly lifted his eyes again. Daniel's expression had not changed once since the interrogation began. No anger. No satisfaction. Only steady control. That calmness unsettled Reinhardt more with every passing minute because deep down he understood something he did not want to admit. The captain across from him no longer needed to prove he belonged there. The room itself had already decided. The clock on the far wall ticked softly above the radiator while Captain Daniel Brooks turned another page inside the thick military file. General Otto Reinhardt remained seated across from him, but the balance inside the room had shifted quietly during the last hour. The old German officer understood it now. Not completely, but enough to feel it. Daniel was no longer interrogating him in the traditional sense. He was removing the protective layers Reinhardt had spent decades building around himself. Slowly, carefully, without force. That frightened the general more than anger would have. Snow continued falling outside Camp Ridley, covering the fences and watchtowers in pale white silence. Somewhere beyond the interrogation room, soldiers moved through the camp changing shifts before sunrise. Their boots echoed faintly down distant hallways. Daniel glanced briefly toward the window before returning his attention to the papers in front of him. You were awarded the Iron Cross twice, he said calmly in German. Reinhardt gave a short nod. For discipline under pressure. Daniel looked at him for a moment. And what did pressure reveal? Reinhardt's face hardened again. You ask philosophical questions like a professor. My father was one. The answer came quietly. Reinhardt studied him with renewed interest. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair. History department at Howard University before the war. A professor, Reinhardt repeated slowly. And his son became a military interrogator. Daniel almost smiled at that. Almost. He preferred books, he said. I preferred understanding people. The old general folded his hands together. And have you? Daniel did not answer immediately. He let the silence settle first. That silence had become unbearable for Reinhardt now because it forced him to fill the empty space himself. Daniel finally spoke. Most men reveal themselves when they stop performing. Reinhardt looked away toward the frost gathering along the edges of the window. His reflection appeared faintly in the glass beneath the yellow light. Older now. Tired. You think I am performing? He asked. Daniel nodded once. You entered this room expecting rank to protect you. Rank matters. Only to men who fear becoming ordinary. Reinhardt's jaw tightened slightly. Daniel noticed the reaction immediately, but did not press harder. He simply opened another section of the file. Several loose documents slid across the desk with quiet precision. One page stopped directly in front of Reinhardt. Typed names filled the paper in long, narrow columns. Transfer approvals. Civilian relocation orders. Transportation schedules. Reinhardt recognized the format instantly. His eyes paused near the bottom of the page, then stopped completely. Daniel watched the moment happen without interruption. You signed that order in 1943, he said softly. Reinhardt did not touch the paper. Thousands of signatures passed across my desk during the war. But you remember this one. The general stayed silent. Outside the room, a distant train whistle drifted through the cold morning air from somewhere beyond the camp. The sound lingered faintly before disappearing into the wind. Daniel lowered his voice slightly. There was a schoolteacher listed on that transfer. Reinhardt slowly lifted his eyes. I do not remember names. Her name was Elise Bauer. Daniel's expression remained calm. She taught literature in Cologne before the war. Reinhardt looked at him carefully now. Why are you telling me this? Daniel rested one hand lightly on the file. Because every piece of paper eventually becomes a person. The old general leaned back deeper into his chair. For the first time since entering the interrogation room, he seemed uncertain where to place his eyes. The desk no longer felt like protection. The walls no longer felt neutral. Even the warm coffee between them had gone cold unnoticed. Daniel reached toward the cup slowly and moved it aside. You expected hatred from me, he said quietly. That would have made this easier for you. Reinhardt stared at him across the desk. And yet you do not hate me. Daniel considered the question for several seconds before answering. No, Reinhardt frowned faintly. Why? Daniel looked directly at him beneath the hanging light. Because hatred is still a form of surrender. The room fell silent again after that. But this time the silence belonged entirely to Captain Brooks. The interrogation room had grown colder by late morning. The steam from the coffee cups was gone now, leaving only faint rings on the scratched wooden desk beneath the hanging light. Captain Daniel Brooks remained seated with the same controlled posture he had carried since the beginning, while General Otto Reinhardt sat quieter than before, his attention drifting more often toward the window than toward the file. Snow continued falling over Camp Ridley in slow white sheets. Beyond the frosted glass, soldiers crossed the yard carrying crates and supply ledgers beneath heavy winter coats. Life moved forward outside the room. Inside, time seemed suspended. Daniel adjusted one page near the top of the folder and spoke without looking up. You had a younger brother. Reinhardt's eyes shifted immediately. It was the fastest reaction Daniel had seen from him all morning. How do you know that? Daniel slid a small document across the desk. A faded personnel file. Karl Reinhardt, mechanical engineer before the war. The old general stared at the paper but did not touch it. Daniel continued quietly. He disappeared in 1944 near Dresden. Reinhardt remained still for several seconds. Then he leaned back slowly in his chair. Missing, he corrected softly. Not confirmed dead. Daniel nodded once. You kept requesting information about him even during military retreat operations. Reinhardt looked toward the window again. He was not meant for war, he said after a long silence. Daniel listened without interrupting. The general's voice had changed now. Less rigid. Less official. Karl repaired watches when we were boys, Reinhardt continued quietly. Tiny pieces. Tiny gears. He believed anything broken could be restored if someone had patience. Daniel glanced briefly toward the silver watch resting near his own file before returning his attention to Reinhardt. And did you believe that too? Reinhardt gave the faintest shake of his head. No. I believed men survived by becoming harder. Silence settled over the room again. But this silence felt different. Not hostile. Heavy instead. Like old snow pressing against weak branches. Daniel folded his hands together. My father used to repair radios at night, he said calmly. Reinhardt looked at him with mild surprise. Daniel continued. He said machines reveal themselves when you stop forcing them. A faint sound escaped Reinhardt's throat. Your father sounds wiser than most generals. Daniel almost smiled again. He would have agreed with you. For the first time, the old German officer allowed the corner of his mouth to move slightly upward. It vanished almost immediately, but Daniel noticed it. He noticed everything. A sudden noise broke the quiet outside the room. Raised voices somewhere down the hallway. Fast footsteps. One of the guards near the door turned his head instinctively. Daniel stood smoothly from his chair and opened the door halfway. A young American corporal hurried past carrying medical supplies, while another soldier spoke urgently beside him. Daniel caught only fragments. Collapsed near Barracks C. Fever since yesterday. German prisoner. Daniel listened for another moment before closing the door quietly again. Reinhardt watched him carefully. One of my men, he asked. Daniel nodded once. Young soldier. 19, maybe 20. Reinhardt lowered his eyes toward the desk. Too young. Daniel sat back down. Most of them were. Neither man spoke after that. The wind rattled faintly against the outside wall, while distant voices echoed through the snowy camp. Reinhardt looked suddenly older beneath the hanging lamp now. as though exhaustion had finally reached him after years of holding himself upright through pure discipline alone. Daniel opened the folder again, but did not read from it this time. Instead, he looked directly at the general. "You know what surprises me most?" Reinhardt slowly raised his eyes. Daniel's voice remained steady. "You spent your entire career surrounded by salutes." He paused briefly. "But I do not think anyone around you ever truly spoke honestly." Reinhardt held his stare without answering. The truth inside the sentence landed quietly between them. No anger, no accusation, just recognition. After several seconds, the old general looked down at his worn gloves again and spoke so softly the guards near the door almost could not hear him. "Power makes honesty expensive." Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair. "Yes," he said calmly, "and loneliness even more so." The hallway outside the interrogation room had become louder by noon. Boots crossed the wooden floors more frequently now, and distant voices drifted through the thin walls of the administrative building as snow continued piling against the camp fences outside. Captain Daniel Brooks sat quietly reviewing another page inside the military file, while General Otto Reinhardt watched him with a different expression than before. The contempt was fading. Slowly, reluctantly, but fading all the same. A sharp knock suddenly interrupted the silence. One of the guards opened the door halfway. "Captain, medical unit needs clearance near Barracks C." Daniel looked up immediately. "What happened?" "German prisoner collapsed during morning roll call." The guard hesitated briefly before adding, "Fever is getting worse." Daniel closed the folder without hurry and stood from his chair. "Get Lieutenant Harris and meet me there." The guard nodded quickly and disappeared down the hallway. Reinhardt watched Daniel button his coat calmly beneath the hanging light. "You are leaving?" Daniel reached for his gloves. "For 10 minutes. The general frowned slightly. "In the middle of an interrogation?" Daniel looked toward him. "A sick prisoner matters more than paperwork." Reinhardt said nothing after that. Daniel paused near the door and glanced at the guards. "Do not move him." Then he stepped out into the freezing hallway. Reinhardt remained alone in the interrogation room, with only the guards nearby. The old German officer looked toward the cold coffee cups sitting untouched on the desk. Snow reflected pale light across the wooden floor, while distant movement echoed through the camp outside. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. Reinhardt found himself listening for footsteps returning down the hallway. Finally, the door opened again. Daniel entered with snow dusting the shoulders of his dark coat. One glove was damp from melted ice. He removed it slowly and placed it beside the file before sitting down once more. Reinhardt studied him carefully. "The prisoner survived?" Daniel nodded once. "Severe fever. Exhaustion. One of mine. His name is Emil Werner." Reinhardt lowered his eyes briefly. "Radio operator," he said quietly. Daniel looked mildly surprised. "You remember him?" Reinhardt stared toward the desk. "He used to stutter during briefings." A faint silence settled again. Daniel removed a folded paper from his coat pocket and placed it near the edge of the table. "Medical transfer approval." Reinhardt noticed the signature immediately. "Captain Daniel Brooks." "You authorized treatment personally," the general observed. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair. "He needed antibiotics." Reinhardt looked at him for several seconds. "You do realize many American officers would not waste medicine on enemy soldiers." Daniel's expression did not change. "Then they misunderstand medicine." Reinhardt slowly folded his hands together. "Or war." Daniel looked directly at him. "Perhaps both." Outside the building, wind pushed snow hard against the windows now. The storm had grown heavier during the afternoon, wrapping the camp in pale gray silence. Daniel opened the file again, but did not read immediately. Reinhardt noticed something different in the captain's face now. Fatigue, perhaps. Or memory. "You have seen too much death for your age," the general said quietly. Daniel remained still for a moment before answering. "Enough to stop admiring uniforms." Reinhardt looked toward the silver bars on Daniel's shoulders. "And yet you still wear one." Daniel glanced down briefly at the insignia before speaking. "Because sometimes decent men have to stand inside broken systems to keep them human." The old German officer absorbed the sentence slowly. It lingered in the room longer than most words spoken that day. Daniel reached toward the desk and adjusted the photograph from St. Quentin again beneath the light. "You know what your mistake was, General?" Reinhardt looked up carefully. Daniel's voice remained calm. "You believed obedience and character were the same thing." Reinhardt's jaw tightened slightly. A nation cannot survive without obedience. True, Daniel replied softly, but it also cannot survive without conscience. Neither man moved after that. The guards near the door stayed completely silent now, listening without pretending otherwise. Reinhardt stared at the younger officer across from him, and for the first time since arriving at Camp Ridley, he no longer saw an obstacle sitting behind the desk. He saw a man whose authority did not come from fear, volume, or rank. It came from something Reinhardt had not encountered in many years. Moral certainty without cruelty. And somehow that unsettled him more than any interrogation ever had. By late afternoon, the storm had nearly buried the outer fence lines of Camp Ridley beneath fresh snow. Guards moved slower now, shoulders hunched against the freezing wind, while floodlights flickered pale yellow across the drifting white ground. Inside the interrogation room, the air had grown warmer from the old radiator hissing near the wall, but the silence between Captain Daniel Brooks and General Otto Reinhardt carried a different kind of weight now. The sharp edges from the morning were gone. What remained felt quieter, more dangerous in some ways. Daniel sat reviewing the final pages inside the military file, while Reinhardt watched him with the stillness of a man slowly realizing he no longer understood the battlefield beneath his feet. The silver watch near Daniel's elbow caught the hanging light for a brief second as he turned another page. Reinhardt's eyes settled on it immediately. The watch was old American craftsmanship. Simple leather strap. Scratches near the edge of the glass. Military engraving on the back. Daniel noticed the glance, but did not hide the watch. "You keep looking at it," he said calmly. Reinhardt hesitated before speaking. "That was not issued recently." Daniel rested one hand lightly beside the watch. No silence followed. Then Reinhardt asked quietly, "Who did it belong to?" Daniel looked down at the scratched glass for a moment before answering. "Colonel James Whitaker." Reinhardt searched his memory immediately. Daniel continued before he could speak. "Normandy, 1944. The general's expression shifted faintly. "Recognition. The officer who negotiated the surrender near St. Lo." Daniel nodded once. "You know the story." Reinhardt leaned back slowly. "I heard rumors." Daniel's voice remained even. Most rumors were wrong. Snow tapped softly against the window while the old radiator hissed beneath the silence. Daniel picked up the watch carefully and turned it once in his hand. Whitaker carried this through North Africa, Sicily, and France. Reinhardt watched quietly now. Daniel rarely spoke this long about himself. During the surrender negotiations, Daniel continued, "One German officer refused to address him directly because Whitaker brought me into the meeting as translator." Reinhardt lowered his eyes slightly. He already knew where the story was going. Daniel did not say it with bitterness. That somehow made it heavier. "The officer kept speaking around me," Daniel said softly, "as if I were furniture." Reinhardt looked toward the desk. "And Whitaker?" Daniel's eyes lifted again. He removed this watch from his wrist and placed it on the table. The room remained perfectly still. Then he said, "If Captain Brooks leaves this room, so do I." Reinhardt said nothing. Daniel turned the watch over gently in his hand. Negotiations lasted 3 more hours after that. "The German officer agreed?" Reinhardt asked quietly. Daniel nodded once. "Eventually." A faint smile touched the corner of Daniel's mouth before disappearing again. "Whitaker gave me the watch the next morning." Reinhardt stared at the scratched leather strap beneath the hanging light. "As a gift." Daniel shook his head. "As trust." Silence filled the room again, but this silence felt different from earlier. Less defensive, more reflective. Reinhardt slowly removed his gloves once more and rested his hands openly on the desk. No performance left now. No posture. Just an aging man beneath tired eyes and fading authority. "You admire him," Reinhardt said softly. Daniel considered the sentence before answering. "He taught me something important." "What?" Daniel placed the watch back beside the file. "A man who is secure in his own authority never needs to humiliate someone else to prove it." The words landed quietly between them. Reinhardt absorbed them without argument. Outside, the storm winds eased slightly, leaving only soft snow brushing against the camp buildings. Daniel opened the final section of the file, but did not immediately look down. "You know," he said calmly, "when you walked into this room this morning, you expected power to look a certain way." Reinhardt's eyes remained lowered toward the desk. Daniel continued, "Older, louder, colder." The general gave the smallest nod. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair. That expectation has cost a lot of men their judgment. Reinhardt looked at him again then, truly looked at him, and for the first time since arriving at Camp Ridley, there was no trace of mockery left in his face. Only something quieter, something harder for a proud man to admit. Respect. Evening settled slowly over Camp Ridley as the storm finally began to weaken. Snow still covered the ground in thick white layers, but the wind had softened into a low whisper moving between the barracks and guard towers. Inside the interrogation room, the hanging lamp cast a warm circle of light across the desk where Captain Daniel Brooks carefully closed the final section of the military file. The sound was soft, final somehow. General Otto Reinhardt remained seated across from him, his posture no longer rigid with military pride but quieter. Now, as though the long day had stripped away something heavy he had carried for years. Neither man spoke for several seconds. The radiator hissed steadily beside the wall, while distant footsteps echoed faintly through the administrative building. Daniel removed his glasses briefly and rubbed one tired hand across his eyes before placing them back on. Reinhardt watched the movement closely. For the first time, the captain looked human instead of immovable. Exhausted, thoughtful, still calm. "How long have you done this?" Reinhardt asked quietly. Daniel glanced toward him. "Interrogations?" The general nodded once. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair. "Long enough to know most men reveal themselves eventually." Reinhardt lowered his eyes toward the closed file. "And what have I revealed?" Daniel considered the question carefully. Outside, a truck rolled slowly across the frozen camp road, chains rattling softly against packed snow. Finally, Daniel answered, "That you spent most of your life trying to appear unshakable." Reinhardt gave a faint breath through his nose. "A military career rewards that." "Yes," Daniel replied, "but it also isolates it." Silence settled again. The old general stared at the silver watch resting beside the file, the same watch he had noticed earlier beneath the lamp. "You know," Reinhardt said slowly, "when I entered this room this morning, I believed I understood exactly who you were." Daniel did not respond immediately. Reinhardt looked directly at him now. "I thought you were chosen to make a statement." Daniel's expression remained neutral. "And now?" The old German officer hesitated. Pride still lingered inside him, but it no longer controlled the room the way it had before dawn. "Now I believe you were chosen because you are the one officer here capable of remaining calm while everyone else loses perspective." Daniel held his gaze without satisfaction. That seemed to surprise Reinhardt most of all. The captain never chased victory during the interrogation. He never tried to humiliate him, never demanded apology. He simply remained steady until the truth revealed itself naturally. A knock sounded softly at the door. One of the guards stepped inside. "Transfer vehicle will arrive in 15 minutes, Captain." Daniel nodded once. "Understood." The guard hesitated briefly before leaving again. Reinhardt looked toward the frosted window where darkness had fully settled across the camp now. Floodlights reflected off the snow in pale gold patterns. "Where will they send me?" he asked quietly. "Pennsylvania first," Daniel replied. "Then processing after winter." Reinhardt nodded slowly. The answer did not seem to matter much anymore. Daniel gathered several papers together neatly while the old general remained silent. Finally, Reinhardt stood from his chair for the first time in nearly 10 hours. His knees stiffened slightly from age and cold. Daniel rose as well out of simple respect. The room felt strangely quiet now that both men stood facing each other beneath the hanging light. Reinhardt picked up his worn gloves from the desk, but did not put them on immediately. Instead, he studied Daniel for one final moment. "There is something I do not understand," he said softly. Daniel waited. "After everything this war has done," Reinhardt continued, "how did you avoid becoming bitter?" Snow drifted quietly against the window behind them. Daniel looked toward the dark glass for a brief second before answering. "Because bitterness gives your enemies 2 victories instead of 1. Reinhardt absorbed the sentence slowly. Then his eyes lowered toward the silver bars on Daniel's shoulders. Earlier that morning, he had refused to acknowledge them, refused to acknowledge the man wearing them. But something inside him had shifted during the long winter day at Camp Ridley. Something pride could no longer fully silence. Very slowly, General Otto Reinhardt straightened his posture. His tired shoulders pulled back with old military instinct. Then, beneath the soft yellow light of the interrogation room, He raised his hand and gave Captain Daniel Brooks a formal salute. The guards near the door froze in complete silence. Daniel did not move immediately. He simply looked at the old general with calm, unreadable eyes while snow continued falling softly outside the window. For a long moment, neither man moved. Beneath the hanging light inside the interrogation room, General Otto Reinhardt remained standing with his hand raised in formal salute while snow drifted softly against the darkened windows of Camp Ridley. The guards near the door stared in complete silence. Earlier that morning, the old German officer had refused to acknowledge Captain Daniel Brooks as a real officer at all. Now the room itself seemed to understand the weight of what had just happened. Daniel looked at Reinhardt steadily, calmly. There was no triumph in his face, no satisfaction, only quiet recognition. Then, with slow precision, Captain Brooks returned the salute. The movement was simple, respectful, nothing more. Reinhardt lowered his hand first. Age and exhaustion suddenly seemed heavier on him now than rank or pride ever had. Daniel stepped around the desk and reached for the thick wool coat hanging near the radiator. He handed it to the general without speaking. Reinhardt accepted it with a small nod. "Thank you," he said quietly in English this time. The words sounded unfamiliar coming from him. Daniel opened the door, and the cold hallway air rushed into the room immediately. One guard prepared to escort the general outside, but Reinhardt paused before leaving. He glanced once more toward the desk where the silver watch still rested beside the closed military file. "Captain Brooks," he said carefully. Daniel looked toward him. The old officer hesitated briefly before speaking again. "Your father was correct about one thing." Daniel waited. Reinhardt glanced toward the watch beneath the lamp. "Broken things do reveal themselves eventually." Daniel said nothing. He simply held the older man's gaze while snowlight reflected faintly through the doorway behind them. Reinhardt gave the smallest nod of acknowledgement and finally stepped into the hallway. The guards escorted him slowly through the administrative building while evening settled fully across the camp outside. Their footsteps echoed against the old wooden floors before fading into the distance. Daniel remained alone inside the interrogation room for several seconds after the door closed. The silence no longer felt tense, just tired. He loosened his collar slightly and looked toward the dark window where snow continued falling beneath the floodlights. Beyond the fence lines, the world was already trying to move on from the war. But inside rooms like this one, remnants of it still lingered quietly inside men who had survived too much for too long. Daniel returned to the desk and picked up the silver watch carefully. The scratched leather strap rested warm in his hand from the heat of the radiator nearby. He remembered Colonel Whitaker placing it on the negotiation table in Normandy almost 2 years earlier, not as a display of authority, but as a statement about dignity, about trust, about refusing to let another man decide who deserved respect. A faint knock interrupted the silence. Lieutenant Harris stepped into the room, carrying several transfer papers. "Vehicle is ready, Captain." Daniel nodded once. Harris hesitated before speaking again. "The general saluted you out there." Daniel placed the watch slowly back onto the desk. "I know." Harris looked genuinely puzzled. "After the way he acted this morning, I did not expect that." Daniel closed the file one final time. Most people spend their lives mistaking confidence for character. Harris remained quiet. Daniel slipped his gloves on carefully. Eventually, reality corrects them. Outside, the transport truck engine rumbled softly near the gate while snow covered its tires and hood in white frost. Guards escorted Reinhardt across the camp yard beneath the pale floodlights. Just before stepping into the vehicle, the old German officer stopped briefly and looked back toward the administrative building. From the second-floor window, a warm yellow light still glowed faintly through the storm. Reinhardt stood there for only a second longer before climbing inside the truck without another word. The vehicle pulled away slowly across the frozen road and disappeared into the falling snow beyond the outer fence line. Back inside the quiet interrogation room, Captain Daniel Brooks turned off the hanging lamp and stood alone beside the dark window. The storm outside had softened into silence now, peaceful, almost gentle. He watched the snow for a long moment before finally reaching for his coat. Then he paused beside the desk one last time and looked down at the empty chair where Reinhardt had sat all day. "War reveals power," he said softly to the empty room. His eyes shifted toward the silver watch beneath the fading light. "But silence reveals character."